好，为度化一切众生，请大家发无上的菩提心。今天我们继续讲。
Today, let's continue with the classes on the Surangama Sutra. In fact, before this, I would like to make a short announcement.
今年极乐法会前面吧，就是这个闭关的话，那我们
we will have the retreat, the annual retreat, and the mantra that we would chant during the annual retreat is Amitabha's mantra. The requirement and the plan of this year for the annual retreat is chanting 1 million of the Tibetan mantra, the mantra in Tibetan, or 6 million in chanting the name of Amitabha if you were to chant this in Chinese. So this year the main practice is Amitabha practice. Therefore, wherever you are, the Sangha and the classes that we have over here in Larungar, I hope that you prepare yourself to be reborn in Sukhavati, the Pure Land, because we will have eventually to die, and I think you should be prepared to be reborn in the Pure Land. Ponzo Rinpoche, in fact, spoke before and taught that whomsoever made an auspicious connection with him will be reborn in Pure Land. Therefore, we should make preparation for this. Every year, I usually would go out and teach and so on. And I don't really know when I will die. Therefore, I think I should at least finish part of this 1 million of recitation of mantra. Therefore, I would like to make this short announcement before the actual class so that you can be prepared. That's the content of annual retreat practice. And this year we practice the practice of Amitabha, so we should be prepared for it. Now let's get into the actual class. That is the Surangama Sutra. The Surangama Sutra is such a supreme teaching. From certain aspect, I can see how people have developed such devotion towards this sutra, maybe because of the history, because of the certain connection that you have with the Zen Buddhism. Therefore, the teachings that's taught in the Surangama Sutra is in fact quite taken seriously by the Chinese practitioners. And this one, particular compared to the previous teachings that we've studied, I think many people probably take this one more seriously than the others, which are the Diamond Sutra, the Amitabha Sutra, the Vimalakirti Sutra, the Heart Sutra, and so on. And I can definitely see that you have more devotion and more faith in the Surangama Sutra. I can tell by my observation. And by the beginning of the teaching of Surangama Sutra, I saw lots of auspicious signs. In fact, I don't usually talk about auspicious signs, and I don't usually believe in those most of the time. But there are definitely some auspicious coincidences that happened. Maybe they're just a coincidence. Maybe they are auspicious coincidences. Anyhow, today is 2019, September the 9th, which we have triple nines in the dates. And in Chinese, the 9 means eternity, or 9 sounds very similar to eternity. When I first encounter this Surangama Sutra, it in fact has 1999 September the 9th, which included 4 nights. And from that day till today, it's been 20 years exactly. Therefore, this is such a 4 nights. It has such auspicious and important symbolism to me, and I think it's part of the auspicious signs. Back then it was 4 nights, and today, when we're actually giving this teaching on the Surangama Sutra, we coincidentally have the 3 nights again, which is quite interesting, isn't it? Such supreme auspicious connection. When Master Xu Yun was giving the Sutra, he said that right before the Surangama Sutra, there was this Utapala flower that all of a sudden blossomed, which was quite wonderful and really beautiful, and it didn't wither for a long period of time. Therefore, we can notice that although Master Xu Yun doesn't have much of the writings on the Dharma teachings, but his main teaching and the main commentary is on Surangama Sutra, where Master Xu Yun said that by reading the Tripitaka, in fact, if you could read in detail, then it plants a good seed in your mind. But if you were to just flip through and skipping the content, then it doesn't really have much of the merit. However, when it comes to Surangama Sutra, if you were to read the Surangama Sutra alone, the merit that it could bring you is quite great. Even if you just read the sutra itself without referring to any commentaries, the merit is incalculable. Some scholars from Peking University, they used to say that Master Xu Yun's chronicles were made by the later generations. Master Xu Yun couldn't have lived to 120 years. That cannot be true. Some scholars hold such ideas, but later on, there are other scholars who then found factual evidence to prove Master Xu Yun's birthday and birth date and death date, which then further prove that Master Xu Yun indeed lived for 120 years. For example, one of these evidences was that Master Xu Yun, when he was young, he was forced to get married, and his wife at that time sent letters to him before, and it was dated. So through such kind of evidence, as well as the evidence that's studied and proved by Master Ben Huan. Master Ben Huan was the disciple of Master Xu Yun. There was I think, a documentary. The name is 100 Years of Master Xu Yun. I didn't finish watching the whole documentary, but I think the majority of the content was indeed quite touching. For example, part of Master Xu Yun's life when he was young was indeed very different than those of other children. I think there were about 20 or so series of episodes of this documentary on Master Xu Yun. In fact, instead of Master Xu Yun, instead of watching other movies and so on, why don't you watch the documentaries or other movies about the previous masters? Wouldn't that be even better? Because you are what you watch. You are whatever kind of information you receive. You will become the kind of person that you want to be, or that is based on the information that you receive. I think in that documentary, according to that documentary, Master Xu Yun was born back in 1840, and then he lived for 120 years. And the whole history was well documented. The scholars nowadays, they only give very vague and really they only use very vague evidence to support their thesis. And those kind of studies could fool lots of people who don't really study. For example, in the previous class, we've already discussed about the whether this sutra is false or is it a true sutra. In fact, the majority of the people don't have the ability to distinguish whether this sutra is genuine or not. On top of that, they would listen to other people's words without having the wisdom to discern for themselves. And as I said last time, in fact, the mistake that you could create by taking this sutra as a fake sutra or even propagate such an idea, to others is probably worse than those of the butchers. That you would destroy other people's spiritual path. In fact, the karmic debt that you owe them would be that you do not have the opportunity to receive the correct teaching, the truth of everything, the truth of phenomena for eons. Because the butchers would only kill people's physical body, or the butcher would only kill sentient beings' physical body, but the ones who slander the sutra, in fact, they kill the spiritual body of people. Just like a poisonous snake would only harm a person, but if you were to stop other people's spiritual path, such kind of bad karma is much more detrimental. Devadatta and others, bad spiritual leaders, could be your spiritual guidance, and you would continue such a wrong path if you were to make such wrong mistake. Some great masters, in their lifetime, sometimes they would manifest in a way that they would slander certain kind of dharma, but then when they approach their senior age or at a certain time of their life, they would repent such kind of mistake that they've made to demonstrate. That's what people should do as well. Just as like Master Hong Yi, that is a famous master in China. Lots of doubts, suspicion, and different opinions were discussed the last class. So later on, whenever it's necessary, I will in detail discuss and explain and study with everyone about why there are some people would take the sutra as a fake sutra from different aspects, such as history, such as other kind of factors. So we'll discuss further if it was necessary. Some teachers or some geshis from Tibet, if they were to go out and study in good monasteries, then they would be able to become really good masters. They'd be able to then later on benefit people in certain areas. However, there are people who then went to a monastery, for example, or a school where they only cherish the words instead of the actual practice. Therefore, what's really important is to have a good spiritual guidance, to have a good teacher. Of course, there are people who are very eloquent, they're quite articulate, and they can influence lots of people. Not only that they're influential in good aspects, they could also be influential in bad aspects. During Second World War, Hitler at that time, he was quite influential, isn't he? Whenever he gives a speech, thousands and thousands of people would get really touched. He was very articulate, really eloquent, and at that time, whatever he spoke, his speech would make a great influence, and the people would listen to him, and the people would believe in him, and would feel that the Jews are the kind of people from the description from Hitler's speech. So, such kind of influence such kind of influence sometimes could be good and sometimes could be bad. Sometimes it could be beneficial, sometimes it could be not beneficial, not only to a person, but to a society. Therefore, whatever we propagate, whatever idea that we try to propagate it to others, I think we should be very objective. I think we should try to benefit others, and we should base on factors on factual evidence rather than only based on what you've heard. This is quite an important point. Therefore, the Surangama Sutra, later on, I think when I have an opportunity, I will also share some of the commentary where it talks about the merits of Surangama Sutra, as well as the historical, as well as the masters from the history and their insights that they've gained through studying of this sutra. The first story I would like to tell you is from the Tang Dynasty. There was a master, his name is Weique. Master Weique, according to the Song Dynasty's great history of great masters, once he went to Fan Rong's home. If you remember Fan Rong, he was the cabinet who translated or helped into translation of the Surangama Sutra into Chinese. And when he visited Fan Rong at his home, at that time, Fan Rong took out the 10 volumes of the Surangama Sutra. And
交给那个4个出家人就4个出家人。
he then
然后他
gifted
这样呢，就是
each
他
volume
那个
to
带领
each one of
楞严
the
经的这种情况
monastics,
这个楞严
where
经
he
的
invited
情况
10
那有些
monastics
就是
into
当时
his
那个
home at that time,
韦
and
觉
Master
有
Wei-Chue
大
was
师
one
的
of
话
them.
呢，从圣秀那里得到的。
Of
但
course, in
当时
history,
按照
there's
从
another
他
another
当时这个
explanation that
韦觉
Master
大师的
Wei-Chue,
话
in fact,
得到这个楞严经的话
received
呢
the
是
Surangama
第4
Sutra
卷
from Master
他得到
Xinqiu,
之后呢，就是非常的这个
and
欢喜
he
非
received
常
the
的
4th volume
欢喜
of the
当
Surangama
时可
Sutra.
能方居士就是
At
对
that
他是
time,
传述还是怎么样，
Master
不太
Faro
清楚，反正可能是为了表达一个缘起还是什么，就是对4个神人呢，就是分了那个
gifted this each volume to different monastic. It wasn't really described very clearly in the history. Anyhow, at that time,
既然这个
he
当时呢
offered this
韦觉
opportunity
三世是非
for
常的
these
这种
10 monastics to make
有
auspicious
信心，然后
connections to
他
this
自己向
Surangama
这
Sutra.
个
And upon receiving
谢
this
那个
4th
注释
volume
这个谢
of
注释
Surangama
那
Sutra,
谢注释
Master
的话呢
Wei-Chue
他当时是
arose great confidence in this
11年
teaching.
当中这个祈
And
祷这个文殊菩萨的
in order to write a commentary up on this sutra, for 11 years, the Master Wei-Chue supplicated to Manjushri. For 11 years, that's quite dedicated. And once in his pure vision, pure perception, he saw Manjushri enters into his mouth and dissolved into his body. And then right after that, he was able to start writing commentary on the Surangama Sutra, and he composed a commentary on the 3 volumes of Surangama Sutra. And after finished composing this commentary, he dreamt that Manjushri left him through his mouth again. And after that, he was not able to write anymore. So sometimes we can see it's just like Ponso Rinpoche. He has 3 types of writings. One is terma, one is his commentary, and one is his commentary on the sutras, and the other one is on the tantras. So in the mainland area, lots of great masters, including Song Dynasty, Ming Dynasty, and great masters in the Chinese history, what they've said in common is that the commentary that they all study is the commentary that's written by Master Wei-Chue. The other one is Master Guanding. I'm not sure if that refers to Master Qi, in fact, but the time is a little bit off if it were him. Maybe it was. It was the disciple of Master Qi, because Master Qi was 100 or 200, in fact 200 years prior to the translation of Surangama Sutra into Chinese language.
所以这是一个方面的，就是还有呢，在明朝的时候
In Ming
明朝的
Dynasty,
时候
there
呢
was a master.
有一个叫做
His name was
真见大
Master
师
Zhen Jian.
真见大师的话呢，他也是依靠这个楞严经
And
而这个开
through
悟的。
the
然后楞严
study
经而
of
开悟的话
Surangama
呢，后
Sutra,
来
he
他就
gained
看到楞严经
full
觉
realization.
悟，然后就是开始出家。出来再以
In
后呢
fact,，
他
after
就
he
向
gained realization
写
and
写
insights,
注释
and
写注释
he
的话
decided
没有
to
那么短短的时间当中
get
写就
ordained.
他
And after he
就
got
读了这个 10年
ordained,
就
he
刚才
read
是他就
Surangama Sutra
祈
for
祷的
10 years.
11年以后才写的。然后这个真见大师的话呢，就是他就是读了这个10年。
Master Jin Jian continued to read the sutra and study the sutra for 10 years. And during his once he dreamt, once he got ill and dreamt of the 3 saints of the West, that those are Mahatamkata and Avalokiteshvara and Amitabha. And he said that in his dream he told the 3 saints saying that I cannot go with you to the Pure Land because I have to write commentaries on the Surangama Sutra. And after he got well, after he woke up, he got well, and then he started composing this commentary. Of course, his commentary was not all received. It was some people slandered him, and some people really praised him for this commentary.
包括做一些讲记也好，就是写一些注释也好，
I think when it comes to writing commentaries and when it comes to transcripts, when it comes to
就写书啊，就是包括
writing
做一些
books,
讲记的话，那就是我们
I really hope
当然一
that
方面有一个时效性，就可能
on
做
one
一些参
hand,
考啊，就是这样
it
子
really
有必要的，就
helps
是然后你们也
people
可
to
能
read
做一些
the
讲记的话，
transcripts
我看到
of
我
the
们很多
classes
确实发现
very
就是还是
quickly.
很
That's
很
really
辛苦，就是
wonderful.
连夜的
I
就是
know
马上
that
做
they
讲记
do
然后
their
给大家
commentaries
就是
and
还没有往之
transcripts
前的话
really
呢，就
quickly
提供
and
提供
provide
这
the
个
transcripts
有一些什么
very
这个提
timely
供
to the
这
others
个
so that they
就
can
是
review
这
the
个方便嘛，
class.
就是这个是
This
非
is
常必要的。
providing
但是可
the
能后面要
necessary
这个说明就是
convenience.
展示为
But
定
I
稿
think
那
later
一
you
些
have
定稿的
to
话，那我们
provide this short
最好
sentence
是
saying
可
that
能
this is not the final
是吧，就
version
是中间
so
就
that
是
people
有
would
一
know
段时间，因为我们有时候
that
是
this
时间
is
特别
not
急的
the
话，
final
任何
version,
事
that
情
there are
就是
and
做
there
的不
could
是
be
特
some
别的
mistakes
这种
that's
效率上不
included
是
in
不是
these
很好的，
transcripts,
所以
in the
我
very
们真正
timely
要做一些
yet
讲解
rather
的话呢，
quite
它是
rushed
这个前
transcripts.
年大计吧，就是可以说是就是一直
Therefore, I
这
think
个
it's quite
就是
necessary
扭传
to
拜释，就是这样的话
revise the
那么
first
这个文字的这
transcript
种功夫和文字
and
的这
edit
种
the
严谨
first
纪律
transcript and
啊，就
take
这一点呢
take some time
非常
for
重要
it
哪怕
to
是
get
不管是
better
哪一个这
written
个大
and
师也好，
without
上
any
师也好，
mistakes.
谁
This
的
is quite
这些教
important
研，就是如果流传下来的话呢，效果很好，
because
这样是特别好。我最近翻译那个前几年他们编的那个藏文的一个法王如意宝的
because when it
那
comes
个
to
教研集吧，就是教研集，
comes
总
to
共有好像那
benefiting
个
the later
80
generation,
多章吧，就是80多章。但是
I think it's quite
中间呢，就是
necessary
我遇
to
到
then
很多不同的这个
revise
心态，
and
有时候呢，
it's
可能
quite
哇，
necessary
就是
to
这个
make
贡献很大，就
corrections
是对
and
就
to
这
make
里
sure
面的很
that
多法
all
王
the
的这个
things
这些
written
教
down
研
are
就是全部
factual.
都就
For example, earlier I was translating the teachings collected by lots of the disciples, the teachings taught by Ponsodol Rinpoche. Sometimes when I read some of the teachings, I felt like, wow, this teaching is quite precious. It's so wonderful, and I'm so grateful for people who then collected this teaching and written it down. And sometimes when I read certain titles and I have no idea what they're talking about, and then I asked, and then I tried to ask who the editor is. None of them wanted to say that they're the bad editor. Therefore, I think it's quite necessary to ask each editor to write their names there so that I can find each of the person who is responsible for each of the transcripts of the teaching. So sometimes my feelings would fluctuate when I flip through the book that has Ponsodol Rinpoche's teaching. Sometimes I feel rather quite grateful and happy. Sometimes I feel really quite upset about that. I don't really understand what it is. Of course, the other aspect of it is the collection of the teachings and all the aspects of a great master. From yesterday or today, actually, I really want to start collecting the audios and videos of Ponsodol Rinpoche. And I would hand this job to the female disciples. It used to be the task of the male practitioners, but I would like to then hand over this job to the female practitioners because the male disciples, they have lots of work and they couldn't find the appropriate people to do so. And from yesterday and today onwards, I really want to collect all the Ponsodol Rinpoche's audio as well as video that is given in China as well as abroad. Even if it's just a teaching of a stanza, even if it's one lyric song by him or so, any of these kind of audio or videos, I really want to collect them because it would be quite precious. And if we don't do this now, I think the disciples of Pontsokgon Rinpoche would then pass away, and it's going to get even more difficult to collect the audios and the videos of Pontsokgon Rinpoche. I think I've mentioned it before. I really rejoice Trungpa Rinpoche's disciples whom collected the videos and audios of Trungpa Rinpoche. They've collected and protected in some ways, as well as organized it really professionally and quite proficiently. Also, it has something to do with the equipment at that time. In fact, our equipment we had was really not sufficient. The audio and the video, they were all quite blurry and fuzzy, but the equipment Trungpa Rinpoche's disciples had in United States were quite excellent. All the video and audios recorded in his centers was quite precious and valuable that we can use nowadays, and we can still see Pontsokgon Rinpoche right now. Therefore, such a kind of wealth, the wealth of our spiritual treasure, or the wealth of our culture, all of these kind of videos and audios, in fact, is quite necessary to preserve, as this is an important aspect of our wealth. On top of the videos and audios, in fact, Trungpa Rinpoche's disciples also wrote a lot of the encounters, stories of encounters. They didn't write down lots of those stories or something like almost like a fairy tale story, such like my teacher could fly and so on. In fact, his disciples wrote down the factual evidence, the factual encounters, such as what time and when this disciple had met the teacher, whether there's a smile of the teacher, what kind of trigger, what kind of emotion that triggers this disciple, and so on. Today, in fact, I felt that these kind of stories are quite necessary to record. I was thinking of the movie Inception, where there was a gadget that could remind the person that of the storyline. And when I was reading back into my calendar, some of the little notes that I wrote down in my calendar that was 20 years ago, in fact, it could trigger me of the memories back then. In the West, in the simultaneous as well as consecutive translations. In fact, the scholars and the interpreters, they would use some very short symbols to trigger their memory, and that could remind them what kind of logic links and what kind of contents was stated. So I think such kind of translation and interpretation is rather quite wondrous. It's quite interesting to be able to use some symbols to remind them the whole content. Pontsokgon Rinpoche used to do so, that he would teach for half an hour straight, and then he would ask me to translate to others, and while waiting for me to translate, he would then eat his tsampa, he would take his medicine, he would drink his tea, and at that time I would continuously to speak, and I would stand at the window of the shrine hall and speak to the whole audience and so on. And Pontsokgon Rinpoche would, after a while, look at me and saying that, have you finished translating? And sometimes I would write because the content is so long, sometimes it would take for about half an hour. And then I would write down some short forms or shorthands for certain names, such as Atisha, I would just write an A and so on. In fact, before 1999, between 1987 till 1999, I was translating for Ponsogo Rinpoche in the consecutive format. And then in 1999, I found that there's such equipment that could help us to have the simultaneous interpretation. Therefore, I started the simultaneous between 1999 to 2004. Or rather 2003. I think simultaneous interpretation is rather quite timely, and it could convey the information really quickly. Each masters have rather very different styles. For example, there are the teachers who would say, when I went to India, and then wait for the interpreter to say that when I went to India. But there are the Rinpoches or masters who would speak for a long period of time and wait for the translator to finish. I remember that Trunley Rinpoche, who is the father of Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche, I think it probably Sanji Kunjo told me this story that Trunley Rinpoche would speak for half an hour and then left the shrine hall and let the translator to translate while he walks around in the garden and enjoy the scenery in the garden. So he would walk around to look at the flowers, and the translator would translate the joke part, and the disciples would all laugh. And the Trunley Rinpoche would look at the flowers and also laugh along with them outside of the tent where the translator and all the disciples are in. So he would come back after a long time, and he would ask the translator, have you finished translating? If not, then okay, I'm going to come back later, okay? So different masters and translators, they all have a very, very different style. I don't know where I got that. Anyhow, I was talking about I was going to tell you a few stories so that we can finally got back into the actual text. Anyhow, my point was that in terms of translation, in terms of transcripts, in terms of writing books, I think people should be rather quite serious about it, especially when it comes to the written words. It's quite crucial to make sure that they're very accurate, because they will last for a long time to benefit future generations. On the other hand, we should collect the stories, the teachings, and the sounds and the videos and the life stories of great masters. So as the disciples, we should carry such responsibility of doing so, because it would influence whether you can continue such lineage. If we can carry such responsibility and successfully carry such videos and audios and all of these kind of stories and teachings that's passed down from our previous masters, then we can call ourselves successful. We've fulfilled our responsibility. As Buddhists, in fact, a group of us, I understand that a group of you, in fact, place the importance or focused on the aspect of building architectures and doing all these kind of propagation. And there are a group of people who then have a great interest and hold up responsibility of continue with the aspect of the teaching. So the thing that we are currently doing is that
这个世界里面呢，就是留下他们
We
的印
want
象。
to
那么我这个目的是什么呢？其实我们所遇见到的这些上师呢
continue
确实是非常
the
好的。就那天说的
the
一样的，
voices and the videos, or rather keep such materials to the future generations. The great masters, not only that they did not harm any sentient beings, in fact, they've only benefited sentient beings.
就各种各样的事情
In
的话
any
呢
kind of situation
从来
they're
都是
in,
人老人
aging or
完全是为
illness
佛
or
所
even
做的这
death,
样的一个大菩萨的
all of
行为的
such
话
kind of
那他们的
actions
这个
are
语
only
言他
done
们的
to
这种
benefit
思想
sentient
就留
beings.
下来的
So
话
for such
呢
great
这个论是应该
bodhisattvas,
是非常有
we should
有
keep
这个
their
利益的 因
teachings
为
and
这
their
个呢还
stories
是有这
so
种传
that
承的价
all
值
of
传
these
承
kind
的
of
力量
information
如
could
果没有
benefit
这
the
样
sentient
如果没有
beings
这
in the
样的话
future
呢我们可
generations,
能
and
对一半的
it
这个思想
could
一半的
carry
思
such
一半的一些
energy
就
and
是
such
智慧的话那
blessings
就
that's
不会
given by the great master, the
付
great
出这么
bodhisattva.
多的这个代价吧因为我们要做
If
这
it
些
was
事情的话呢
not
其
to
实
benefit the
也
future
并不是那么
generation,
顺顺利利的
if
不
it
管
was
什么事
not
情呢还是
for
有
the
一定的
benefit
这个
of
阻
a
碍啊
future
就需要
generation,
这个
we
这
don't
个
really
人力
have
啊
to
财力啊
spend
各方面
such
需要付出
energy
在这个时
and
候呢
such
我们还是
effort.
得对很多这个众生呀哈
So
很多
with
这个
the
不同根基的这些
keeping
众生呢
such
都要
mind,
考虑到
keeping
这
such
一
a
点也很重要的
intention in mind of benefiting sentient beings, I think is quite important to carry on this
那现在正是这样
teaching, carry on the previous master's teaching. So now let's
念
continue.
经的时候慢慢讲吧对吧
I had no idea how I got so distracted.
这还
Anyhow,
是很有
we haven't really got into the actual teaching yet.
信心
But anyway, let's move rather quite slow
再
and
讲讲
steady
今
in
天
the
这
teaching
样
of
的事情
Surangama
呢
Sutra.
如是无
I
问
really
啊
hope
就是仪
these
式
kind of stories
或
and
在这个
my talks
自我
could
法成
give
就
rise
是
to your
喜欢
devotion.
近摄与
Anyhow,
大比
let's
丘
get into the
中
actual content.
前250
Thus have I
人
heard,
之中
once
今天准备讲这段话
the Buddha stayed in the Jatmana Vihara near Shravasti with 1,250 bhikshus, most of whom were great arhats who had crossed the stream of transmigration. That's the only thing that we are going to study. Do you think
那就
there's nothing to talk about with the first sentence?
前段时间我们
That's
讲
not
说
going to
那个
happen.
去年是吧就是
Last year,
无
when
极
we
境和
were
禅境的时候
studying
呢
the
以这个无缘来
Vimalakirti
讲
Sutra and other sutras, we talked about the beginning from the aspect of the 5 perfections. And today we're going to study this part from the 6th accomplishment that is widely taught in the mainland Buddhism, in the great masters in mainland Buddhism.
这里呢就是我按照那个
And the 6th accomplishment, what are those 6 accomplishments? They're quite similar to the 5 perfections. Master Zixuan, who was one of the great masters who wrote the commentary on the Surangama Sutra, and he also, along with many other Chinese masters, in the commentary of the Sutra of perfect enlightenment, they stated these 6 kinds of accomplishment. The first one is the accomplishment of faith, and that is thus. The second one is the accomplishment of listening. I heard, and the third one is accomplishment of time. That is 3 times, and then the accomplishment of the master, who is the Buddha, and the accomplishment of the place, and that is the Jatmana Vihara, and the accomplishment of assembly, that is the 1,250 bhikshus. So let's begin with the first one. Thus have I heard. So thus is quite important. It means that truthfully truthfully and faithfully that have I heard this teaching. Not only that have I heard it, thus have I recorded in such a way as well. So you have to have faith in terms of hearing as well as recording. It is not that the sutra was written down based on conceptual ideas or habitual patterns that is rather defiled. It is completely what the Buddha had taught. So it is stated as thus have I heard. It is said that the Dharma is like the great ocean. You can enter the ocean of Dharma with faith, and you can cross the ocean of Dharma with wisdom. Therefore, any kinds of the teachings that's included in the Dharma, you have to have faith. Because if you don't have faith, you won't be able to you won't be able to understand it, and if you don't have it in the middle, you won't be able to persist in studying the Dharma. And then at the end, if you don't have the faith, you won't be able to fulfill or completely comply the Dharma. So those are in the beginning, the middle, and the end. You have to all have faith. In the West nowadays, and the students don't fully follow their teacher because creativity and personal opinion is encouraged. However, in the Eastern philosophy, it is quite important for the disciples, for the students to truthfully written down and record what the teacher had taught. There was this conversation that happens between the Buddha and his disciples, as well as, for example, even in the analogues of Confucius, it was truthfully recorded, the Buddha's teaching as well as the students' answers. Therefore, the word thus is quite important to remember. So that's the first one. Thus, the accomplishment of faith. The second accomplishment is the accomplishment of hearing. Thus have I heard. I refers to Shariputra, refers to Vajrayana, and so on. All of these great arhats. These great arhats have heard these teachings. Over here, I refers to Podagala. In the heretics, they would hold on to the self as the solid existence of self, and in Buddhism there are three types of different kinds of self, and the self that is the name, and the self that is the true self, and so on. But over here, the I shows that refers to the arhats who have truthfully heard these kind of teachings. And the third one talks about the accomplishment of time. On one hand, in India at that time, there was no tradition of recording the time, the specific time. On the other hand, the way we can understand the accomplishment of time is through the three times. In history, we usually then talk about at a certain time and time this political event happened or something happened. So this kind of time is quite necessary to record. However, these kind of teaching that is included in the Dharma is not subjugated to the change of time. It's not going to change based on the change of time, unlike the news nowadays that we have. So that's the accomplishment of time. That is the perfect time at all times. And then the fourth accomplishment is the accomplishment of the master, who is the Buddha. The word the Buddha means the
在
awakened
这里
one,
呢，就是
the
佛讲到
enlightened
的这
one.
些真理呢，
Therefore,
都
over
没有
here,
说
the
过，没有
accomplishment
任何的
of
这种这
the
个
master is the Buddha.
就是什么这个期货啊，就是
And
虚
he
妄啊，
only
就是等
speaks
等
of the
就是
truth. He
所以
does
这个
not
中
lie
论
to
的
us.
这
He
种
does not
这
deceive
个拥有
the
的话呢，
ascension
就是我们
beings.
在其
And
他
the
当
merits
中
of
呢，
the
就是
Buddha
知道
was
是他
taught in
如何
other
断除
different
啊障
sutras
子，
and
所以
shastras, where
这
it talks
个
about how the Buddha then
证悟这个
eradicated
智
the
慧，
two kinds
然
of
后他
obscurations and
所建
enlightened
立的
fully to
学
the
术
wisdom.
呢，就是
And
那么
the
就是实
teaching
践
that's
的
given
完全
by
的
the
这些道
Buddha,
理
in
呢，在
fact,
其他当中也
is
是知道的。
is
然后第五
truthful
个的
and
话呢，就是
beneficial to
不圆满
others. This is
不圆满
widely
呢，就
taught
是他这
in
里这个
other
失落
teachings.
法称啊，就是失落法称
The
是摄我称，
accomplishment, the
然
fourth
后
one
这
is the
个就是
the
祈愿
fifth
建
one
设，
is
就是那个
the
祈愿开始的
accomplishment
这个
of
建设。
place
那么这个是主
that
圆满
is
的，
the
主圆满的话呢，实际上是当时这
Jatavana
个
Vihara.
佛陀这个所
The
宣所能
sixth
严禁
one
的这个
is
地方啊，
the
就是能严禁的地
accomplishment
方。
of
那么而且呢，就是这个
the
这
retinues
个地方呢，
or
就是佛陀已经总共前后得了
assemblies
25年了。那其他地方呢，就是得的时间都是并不是很长的。我记得《大智度论》当中也有一些这个问答吧，就是说是当时有人这个问，就是为什么佛陀呢，就是迦毗罗波是他的这个故乡，他在哪里就是待的时间不长，
The Buddha, in fact,
成佛之
didn't
后在另外
stay
一
for a
个国
long
家
period
待
of
的时
time
间那
in
么
his
长。
hometown.
然后这个回
But
答的
he
话呢，
stayed
就是
in
迦毗
other
罗波佛
places
陀他
for a
自己
longer
呢就是
period
没有
of
染
time.
性，就是本来
And other
在
people
待在迦
question
毗
why
罗波
doesn't
也好，
the
其他地
Buddha
方都
stay
是
at
一
his
样的。
hometown?
但是如果在迦毗
And
罗
the
波的
answer
话呢，
is
就是
that the
佛
Buddha,
陀
in
以
fact,
外的
doesn't
其他
have
人，包
any
括释迦族啊，
grasping
这些人
towards
的话呢，有
the
染性。有
places.
些人认为是佛陀是我们这边的人，他们是染
There are
性
people
的。
who
有些人呢，就是认为是
would
就是
feel that
什么释迦族是我们的怨地，就是他们产生嗔恨性的，就是所以他们
the
有很多，
Shakya
而且可能
family
佛陀也
is
是当
the
时
enemy
有
or
这
is
个
the
加修
is
的
a
众
friend
生
or
是
foe.
很难度化的，就是所以就佛陀呢，就是
Some say
因为
that
他
the
大智度论
most
当中也讲，
difficult
佛陀呢
ones
并不是因
to
为
help
必须
are
的
the
待的
ones
地方是
who
好玩啊，或者是有其他的，看哪个众生
are your family
有这
members
个
or
缘分的话呢，就
are
是到哪
from
里
your
去度
hometown.
众生，就是所以呢，就是色为称呢，就是应该是他
So the
最
Buddha, in
最
fact,
有缘的，因为
stayed
哪里的
in
这个国王啊，哪
Jatavana
里的很
Vihara
多人
and
的话呢，
Jatavana
就是对
for a
佛陀
long period of
特别
time,
有
the
信心
Shravasti
的，
for a
所
long
以呢
period of，
他
time.
在哪里呢，就是待的时间也
He,
比较
in
比较
fact,
长
the
的，
Buddha had
就比较长
more
的。
auspicious
当然，我们
connections
看到
with
那个
the
发
city
现和
of
那个
Shravasti.
唐僧的这种这个西域界啊，
The
就是这些相关的
discovery
这个
of
书里
different
面看的话呢，
places
就是当时他们去的时
where
候
the
都是这些
Buddha
地方
taught,
都是一
where the
个
Buddha
废墟
gave
啊，就是
teaching
并不是
and
很
the
明显的，
significant
就是
places
就
where
就
Buddha
这
went
样的。
or
但后来
stayed
呢，就是他
didn't get
发现这个地方
discovered
之后呢，就是
until
这些
the 18th century, and it was only
原来法王如意宝去的时候呢，
based on the journal that is written down by Master Faxian and Master Xuanzang.
这里的有一些情况。
When we went there with Ponsogo Rinpoche, Ponsogo
其
Rinpoche
实这个地方的话呢，
give
就
lots
应
of
该是
teachings
佛陀在世
on
间是
how long the
最
Buddha
长
stayed,
最
and
加持力的。
the Ponso Rinpoche told us, in fact, Shravasti was one of the most blessed place where the Buddha stayed for a long period of time, and therefore it is the most blessed place, and so on. All these kind of stories. Lots of the holy places, the pilgrimage sites in India.
应该可以这么讲吧。讲印度圣地是吧？
We're talking about the pilgrimage sites in India.
圣地是这样的，印度圣地呢，现在是成为那个佛教这个圣地。但是
It was recognized as pilgrimage sites or the holy places of Buddhists.
以前那个印度确
We
实
can talk about these kind of places
但现在
now.
呢，就是什么时过境迁了，就应该
In the way that, in fact, lots of the places was quite glorious back in the history. However, now because of the changes in time, in history,
藏传佛教
many of the great holy sites were taken away or were abandoned. Compared to history, where Chandragirti, in terms of Nagarjuna, and all of these great Indian masters, whenever we read these kind of texts composed by the great Indian masters, we all feel such great admiration towards them. But nowadays, in the modern time, there weren't not much great Indian scholars or great Indian Buddhists, great Indian Buddhist masters, although they're quite talented in other kind of areas, such as the scientists and engineers working for Boeing and working in Silicon Valley. The great companies in United States, they all like the engineers and information technology engineers. In India, now the so-called Indian Silicon Valley is Bombay, and MIT, the Massachusetts Information Technology Institute is, or the IIT, the India one is quite comparable to the one of the MIT in United States. So from different aspects, we can see that the Indian people are still very smart, except that not many of the great philosophers compared to the ones that they've had in the history. How lots of the Buddhist sites were discovered, in fact, all the credits goes back to Alexander Cunningham, who was a British. We should remember this archaeologist's contribution. Though he's only a scholar and an archaeologist, but he had discovered and he had then reviewed lots of the Buddhist sites from ashes, from the abandoned places. Alexander Cunningham was a great archaeologist who discovered or rediscovered many of the important Buddhist sites. Alexander Cunningham stayed with the army at that time, with the British army, and he saw this rock where it has lots of scriptures on it, and he asked around, and not many people recognize such words anymore, and they said maybe it's the ancient writings of Buddhists. By that time, coincidentally, the translation of Master Faxian as well as Master Xuanzang's journal was translated into English language. And then he read those two books. He compared the writings of the descriptions of those two masters' writings, and then he went back to India again to start to rediscover around those areas around 1837. Around 1837, he reviewed of the site and determined that the site of Deer Park, at that time, Deer Park was already taken by the Jainism. And he also reviewed the place of Lumbini, where the Buddha was born, as well as the Mahabodhi temple. Back in 12th and 13th century, the Muslim army invaded all the Buddhist temples and holy sites, and in order to protect the Mahabodhi temple, the monks over there buried the entire temple, the entire Mahabodhi temple, into with the sand and soil, and made it into a small hill. Back in 1961, this archaeologist Alexander Cunningham, then he reviewed this is the place where Mahabodhi temple is, and discovered it and dug it out of the hill. So his finding goes hand in hand with the help of the Master Xuanzang as well as the Master Faxian's writing, their books, because in the ancient times the Indian people did not have the habits of record their history, and lots of the history was discovered later on with the writings of people who traveled to India. In fact, from the external area at that time, Mahabodhi was not found. Lots of the Buddhist holy sites was later on taken by different religions, such as the Deer Park was taken by Jainism and used it as pigsties. Another place that is called Odatampuri, that was a temple. In fact, it was one of the 3 most important temples in India. At the most prosperous time, at its peak time, there were about 12,000 monks studying over there in Udayapuri temple. Marpa as well as Naropa, and all of these great saints, they studied over here at Udayapuri. When Marpa Lotsawa, who was actually Tibetan, but he traveled quite often to India, and he went to this temple and told Naropa, saying that I have a disciple, his name is Milarepa. Milarepa, in fact, received the prediction from received guidance from the Dakinis, and said that he should study the practice of exchanging consciousness, taking consciousness. And then Naropa recited this verse where he said, in the grave darkness that is in the north, there was a master who is just like the sun when the sun shines on the snow peak. To such a great illuminating master, I prostrated to great master Milarepa. And when Naropa folded his hands and prostrated towards the direction of Tibet to show his reverence to Milarepa, and then all of the mountains and vegetations at that time prostrated towards the same direction along with Naropa. So even till now, all the mountains and vegetations are still leaning to the direction of Tibet, seeming that they are prostrating or they are venerating Milarepa, who was in Tibet at that time. At that time, we really wanted to go to Udayapuri temple. There are 2 kinds of two kinds of architecture that is quite commonly seen in Tibet, and one of those are based on the architectural style of Udattapuri, and that place is Sangye Temple. Sangye Temple adapts this architectural style. But the temple, the Udattapuri temple, in fact, it was completely destroyed by Muslim army at that time, back in the 12th and 13th century. There was nothing left. And on top of the ashes and the collapsed temple, there was the temple of, or rather the a Muslim's charnel ground where they bury corpse. So between then till the 18th century, Buddhism was Buddhism tradition as well as its holy sites were all buried or destroyed, and lots of the tradition didn't really continue, didn't really last, and that is why you cannot find many of the archaeological sites in India of Buddhism. Sri Lankan master who brought lots of disciples and reconstructed the Sangha over there at Mahabodhi. There's some old photos or illustrations of Mahabodhi when they rediscovered this temple. At that time, the Lhasa Jowo statue was also enshrined on the second level of Mahabodhi, and according to some of the historical record, it was that the Jowo statue was originally at Mahabodhi and then later on brought to Tibet through the princess when Princess Wenchen came into Tibet. He brought that as a gift. So sometimes when we look into the history, we would see that the conflicts among people, among different religions, really made lots of the detrimental destructions that cannot be recovered. Lots of the other religions are not like Buddhism. Lots of the philosophies are not like Buddhism, where we talk about avoid all evil and practice all good. They're not as inclusive. Buddhism and all other kinds of religions should, in fact, learn from such history, especially we should remember such historical stories where, in fact, we should learn from such histories, and we should use different means to protect and to preserve different kinds of teachings as well as artifacts, as well as the master's teachings and so on. So the Buddhists should really have great gratitude towards Alexander Cunningham, because without him we would not be able to go to all these great pilgrimage sites such as Mahabodhi and Deer Park.
讲不完。
I don't think I'll be able to finish teaching even the first sentence.
讲了什么六成就当
I only talked about the fifth accomplishment, and the sixth one maybe we'll talk about this next class, okay?
一大比丘中
Here it talks about the 1250 bhikshus. Okay, we'll extend it to next class tomorrow.
所能得一段学子百年，团那尼别转那巴些，结干那些软落这巴，这本从来。